Hey everybody. This is a piece titled Alfred Schmidt on the Critique of Social Nature. This is from the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. It's by a Hermann Kocyba. I'm going to be reading a lot from the German Wikipedia for this, so bear with me. The little bio in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory for Hermann Kocyba says, Hermann Kocyba is senior researcher at the Institute for Social Research and lecturer at the Department of Social Sciences at Goethe University in Frankfurt. Kocyba's dissertation on the problem of contradiction in Marx's critique of political economy, Widerspruch und Theoriestruktur zur Darstellungsmethode im Marxischen Kapital, was supervised by Alfred Schmidt. It was Schmidt, too, who encouraged Hermann Kocyba to engage in the debate about Louis Althusser, Lévi-Strauss, Lacan, Foucault, and Deleuze. As a result, however, Kocyba, unlike Schmidt, felt fascinated by the possibility to read them not as antagonists of critical theory, but as sources of a renewal of critical theory. His actual theoretical work is focused on the conflict between economy and democracy. His empirical research is focused on labor relations, working conditions, and democracy deficits within European institutions, especially within the European Central Bank. Sorry, I was seeing if there's anything else for Hermann Kocyba. Anyway, sorry about that. Wikipedia for Alfred Schmidt says, Alfred Schmidt was born 1931 and died in 2012. Alfred Schmidt was a German philosopher. Alfred Schmidt is considered a, quote, pioneer of an undogmatic emancipatory reception of Marx, end quote. Alfred Schmidt studied history as well as English and classical philology at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main, and later also philosophy and sociology. The student of Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno, came from a humble background. Schmidt's father was a mechanic who represented a noticeable contrast to the commercial, Horkheimer, or intellectual family background, Adorno, of his teachers. In 1960, Alfred Schmidt received his doctorate with a thesis on Karl Marx's concept of nature, which opened, quote, a new chapter in the reception of Marx, end quote. Translated into 18 languages, it became, quote, one of the most widely read books in the European protest movement, end quote, of the 1960s and 1970s. In 1972, Schmidt became professor of philosophy and sociology at the University of Frankfurt, succeeding Jürgen Habermas in Max Horkheimer's chair. His Thursday lectures were legendary in the 1980s and also attracted many non-specialists. In 1999, Alfred Schmidt retired, but he continued to give lectures. Alfred Schmidt's main research areas were the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, the history of materialism, the philosophy of religion, Freemasonry, Ludwig Feuerbach, Schopenhauer. Schmidt also worked as a translator of English and French writings. Alfred Schmidt was a member of PEN Center, Germany, and an honorary member of the Schopenhauer Society. Schmidt was a member of the Frankfurt Masonic Lodge, Zur Einigkeit. In 1989, he was awarded the Goethe plaque of the city of Frankfurt am Main, and in 1998, the Federal Cross of Merit on ribbon. In November 2012, the Archive Center of the Johann Christian Senckenberg University Library of the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main received his estate, including numerous correspondences, manuscripts, electronic documents from 3 surviving computers, and his extensive private library, 260 linear meters, around 8,000 books in over 60 moving boxes. And his books include The Concept of Nature and the Teachings of Karl Marx, originally published in 1962, History and Structure, Questions of a Marxist Historiography, published in 1971, Emancipatory Sensuality, Ludwig Feuerbach's Anthropological Materialism, On the Critical Theory, The Idea of Critical Theory, Elements of Max Horkheimer's Philosophy, with Werner Post, What is Materialism? Critical Theory is Philosophy of History, 1976, 3 Studies on Materialism, Schopenhauer, Horkheimer, Problem of Happiness, 1977, Critical Theory, Humanism, Enlightenment, 1981, Goethe's Wonderfully Luminous Nature, Philosophical Study of the German Late Enlightenment, The Truth in the Garb of a Lie, Schopenhauer's Philosophy of Religion, 1986, Idea and World Will, Schopenhauer's Critic of Hegel, History of the Origins of Humanitarian Freemasonry, Deistic Roots and Aspects, posthumously edited by Klaus-Jürgen Grün and Thomas Furva, Salia, Leipzig, 2014, History of Materialism, posthumously edited by Klaus-Jürgen Grün and Oliver Hein, 2017, Marx as a Philosopher, Studies from the Perspective of Critical Theory, edited by Michael Jeska, Bernhard Gürlich, zu Klampen. All right. So, to the actual article now. This was translated by Jacob Blumenfeld, or Feld. I think he's American. Well, he is American. From the early 1960s onward, Alfred Schmidt, who lived from 1931 to 2012, provided a decisive impulse for the critical reappropriation of Marxist theory and the further development of critical theory in West Germany and beyond. His work on the philosophical historical presuppositions of the critical theory of Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse, and his confrontation with French structuralism, especially the Althusser school, attracted attention even beyond academic philosophical debates. In addition, Schmidt focused on the history of philosophical materialism, the philosophy of Schopenhauer, Goethe's philosophy of nature, Sigmund Freud's philosophy, and in light of his interest in the intellectual history of Freemasonry, the modern deism of the Enlightenment. Furthermore, from the 1960s, Schmidt translated or published numerous works by Marcuse, Horkheimer, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Henri Lefebvre, and Anton Pannekoek. As the editor of Max Horkheimer's collected works, together with Gunzelin Schmid-Neuer, and the editor of the republished Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Schmidt laid the decisive foundations for the reception of original critical theory. According to German Wikipedia, Gunzelin Schmid-Neuer he was born in 1947. Gunzelin Schmid-Neuer is a German philosopher and professor emeritus at Niederrhein University of Applied Sciences in München-Gladbach. He is the son of the philosopher Friedrich Alfred Schmid-Neuer. Schmid-Neuer studied philosophy, sociology, political science, and psychology in Munich and Frankfurt am Main. After receiving his doctorate in 1997, In 1977, he headed the Max Horkheimer Archive of the Frankfurt City and University Library until 1996. Between 1991 and 1998, he worked as a private lecturer at the University of Frankfurt am Main. From 1998, he was a professor of the University of Frankfurt am Main, and since 1992, he has held acting professorships at the Universities of Frankfurt am Main and Dortmund, and at the Darmstadt University of Applied Sciences. Since 2002, Schmidt has been a professor of philosophy at the Niederrhein University of Applied Sciences. He became professor emeritus in 2015. Schmidt is considered an expert in critical theory. Together with Alfred Schmidt, he edited Max Horkheimer's collected works, 19 volumes, between 1985 and 1996, at S. Fisher Verlag. His writings include Sensuality and Domination on the Conceptualization of Inner Nature in Hegel and Freud, The Remembrance of Nature in the Subject on the Dialectic of Reason and Nature in the Critical Theory of Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse, Gestures from Concepts, Constellations of Critical Theory, History of Ethics, Ethics in Social Work, and as editor with Eva Maria Siga on the Critique of Regressive Reason, Contributions to the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Back to the text. In contrast to his teachers, Horkheimer and Adorno, Schmidt did not come from an upper-class or educated middle-class home. Born in Berlin as the son of a mechanic, he spent his youth in the North Hessen province of Rothenburg an der Fulda, where the family ended up as a result of the war. There, in the spring of 1952, Schmidt passed the school-leaving examination. In the summer semester of that year, he began his studies at the Faculty of Philosophy in the University of Frankfurt, initially studying history, English, and Latin. Attending the lectures of Horkheimer sparked his academic interest in philosophy. Schmidt chose philosophy as his main subject, sociology as his second, and English philology as his third. He also studied classical philology. From 1957 to 1961, Schmidt was a graduate assistant, and from 1961 onwards, a research assistant for Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno at the University of Frankfurt. On the 13th of July 1960, Schmidt graduated with a doctorate in philosophy with the topic, The Concept of Nature and Marx's Conception of Society. Schmidt's thesis, supervised by Horkheimer and Adorno, was published for the first time in 1962 under the title The Concept of Nature and Marx as the 11th volume of the Frankfurt Contributions to Sociology series, edited by Adorno and Walter Dirks. Walter Dirks lived from 1901 to 1991 in Wittnau, was a German Catholic publicist, writer, and journalist. Walter Dirks is considered one of the most influential intellectuals of the Bonn Republic. The Frankfurt Walter and Mariana Dirks Prize, which has been awarded since 1995, is named after him, and since 2000, also after his wife Marianne Dirks. Back to the text. The work attracted international attention. It was translated into 12 languages and went through a total of 4 editions in Germany during Schmidt's lifetime, as well as a series of pirated prints. In the summer semester of 1965, Schmidt received a university teaching position in the philosophical seminar at the University of Frankfurt on lessons in the history of philosophy, in particular the Enlightenment and its tradition. In the following semesters, he dealt with the themes of left Hegelianism, the sociology of Auguste Comte, Karl Marx's critique of political economy, and the philosophies of Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre. In 1972, after the departure of Jürgen Habermas to Starnberg as co-director alongside physicist and philosopher Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of the Living Conditions of the Scientific and Technical World. Schmidt was appointed to Horkheimer's former chair as Habermas's successor. Schmidt held this chair until his retirement in 1999. When Habermas returned to Frankfurt in 1983, a new chair had to be established for him in social philosophy and the philosophy of history. German Wikipedia says Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker lived from 1916 to 2007 and was a German physicist, philosopher, and peace researcher. Back to the text. According to official dedication of this professorship for philosophy and sociology, Schmidt lectured in both subjects during the first years, but then limited himself to courses in the field of philosophy. He remained faithful to his listeners as an emeritus professor, giving lectures on Herbert Marcuse, Ludwig Feuerbach, Heinrich Heine, Spinoza, Lessing, Nietzsche, and Richard Wagner. In addition, he wrote studies on Goethe, in whom he was primarily interested as a natural scientist and natural philosopher. He was also especially fascinated with the philosophy of Schopenhauer. Schmidt continued lecturing and reading about the history of materialism, the sociology of worldviews in the 19th century, the German Enlightenment, and the philosophy of German Romanticism. Furthermore, Schmidt was active in the university's Interdisciplinary Institute for Research in the Philosophy of Religion, which Schmidt co-founded. Schmidt worked as a lecturer in adult education in Frankfurt, in trade union education at the Academy of Labor, and in the context of the Masonic movement. In November 2012, the Archive Center of the Johann Christian Senckenberg University, Library of the Goethe University, Frankfurt am Main, received his entire estate, including correspondence, manuscripts, electronic documents from 3 computers, and his extensive private library. The manner in which the Frankfurt School is usually presented, which divides the representatives of critical theory into a first, second, third, and now even fourth generation, makes it difficult to elucidate Schmidt's specific contribution. In the 1960s, at the Philosophical Seminar at the University of Frankfurt, Schmidt was teaching together with his teachers like Karl-Heinz Haag, who lived from 1924 to 2011, Hermann Schweppenhauser, who lived from 1928 to 2015. Karl-Heinz Haag lived from 1924 to 2011 and was a German philosopher who was a student of Theodor W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer, belongs to the environment of critical theory. One second. And it says Hermann Schweppenhauser lived from 1928 to 2015. As a student of Horkheimer and Adorno, Schmidt saw himself primarily committed to the continuation of their thought. He did not partake in Habermas's critique of the, quote, philosophy of consciousness and its rejection of the critical potential of Marx's concept of labor. Nor did Schmidt take part in the communicative turn in critical theory. The primary goal of Schmidt's philosophical work was to explicate the theoretical motives and philosophical historical presuppositions of the critical theory of Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse. In this way, Schmidt embodied a counterbalance to the linguistic, analytic, action theoretical, or system theoretical, quote, reconstructions of critical theory, which in Schmidt's opinion ran the risk of missing the specific impetus of critical theory. In contrast, his aspiration was to preserve and convey the original content and authentic form of critical theory. New section on the concept of nature. Schmidt's 1962 thesis on the concept of nature in the teaching of Karl Marx had an unusually strong resonance. On the one hand, it was directed against a dogmatic dialectics of nature taught as state doctrine at the time in the Soviet Union, the GDR, and the countries of Eastern Europe. On the other hand, it went against a pure philosophy of praxis perspective, which tends to dissolve history into a dynamic of interaction detached from the metabolic process between humans and nature, thereby ignoring the natural constraints of human existence. In their preliminary remark, Horkheimer and Adorno summarized Schmidt's work within the, quote, Frankfurt contributions to sociology, end quote, as follows, quote, even where nature is not a topic, bracket, in Marx, end bracket, concepts of nature are implied in the theories of labor, value, and commodity. Thus, the responsible representation of the concept of nature also illuminates other parts of the theory. For example, Schmidt corrects the conception of a radical opposition between idealist and materialist dialectics, and thus also straightens out the often cited phrase of Marx that his method merely flirts with dialectics, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Schmidt drew upon the entire corpus of Marx available at that time, including documents from different phases of his theoretical development, particularly the Grundrisse, whose philosophical significance Schmidt recognized early on. In contrast to the philosophical discussion of Marx in the West at the time, Schmidt's thesis studied Marx's early writings intensively in order to establish the connection with certain themes of the middle and mature Marx. He did not therefore reduce the philosophical thought of Marx to the anthropology of the Paris manuscripts. On the contrary, Schmidt stressed that Marx is by no means at his most philosophical when he employs the traditional academic language of philosophy, and so Schmidt thoroughly incorporates the political and economic writings of the middle and mature Marx into the discussion. Schmidt also clarifies the philosophical significance of Marx's critique of economics, which is crucial for a critical concept of materialism. At the same time, Schmidt notes that Marx's critique of political economy is not exhausted by a technical economic analysis. Indeed, Marx's critique is fundamentally a critique of economic categories. To illustrate Marx's position, Schmidt repeatedly draws upon individual writings by Engels, for example, with reference to the concept of the dialectics of nature, and does not shy away from bringing out the differences between the authors. According to Schmidt, the problem of nature and the dogmatic conception of the dialectics of nature could not be solved by elegantly avoiding the entire subject and sticking to a half-baked Marx concerned only with the philosophy of praxis. This tendency could be read in Georg Lukács, Karl Korsch, Antonio Gramsci, and the philosophers grouped around the journal Praxis. Although arising from legitimate opposition to the dogmatic, quote, diamat worldview prevailing in Eastern Europe, but also among many communist intellectuals in the West, these philosophers risked throwing out the baby with the bathwater by eliminating the theme of nature, thus reducing Marxism to a philosophy of history. For Schmidt, the task was to critically incorporate nature into reflection as a historical category mediated by human practice. From the Holy Family, Marx and Engels' first joint text, published in Frankfurt in 1845,
to Friedrich Engels' Anti-Düring in 1878, nature is regarded as mediated by social practice. Nature is developed and constituted by human practice. But nature cannot be dissolved in this way without a remainder. It is the object of human appropriation, and yet does not arise through human appropriation. The nature-mediating social labor process, as a metabolic process between humans and nature, is itself a part of nature. Society is not a mere communication system, rather society is a specific mode of human social reproduction. In addition to the simultaneous emphasis on the social mediation of nature and the irreducibility of nature, which is not completely absorbed in this mediation through social practice, we find in Marx the notion borrowed from Hegel of a second nature of incomprehensible, coercive social forces. Even though in knowledge as well as in practical appropriation, we know we encounter nature in itself, but always only nature already mediated by human practice. It would be ill-conceived to absolutize this aspect of mediation. Such an absolutized mediation which makes the irreducible particularity of nature and individuals into practically subordinate moments of a universal system of mediation represents for Marx the capital relation, which asserts itself as the, quote, automatic subject of the processes of social reproduction. The objection against such an absolutized mediation formed a crucial motive for critique, which saw in this totalization of mediation new natural constraints at work, precisely the constraints of a socially produced second nature. Against a mere standpoint philosophy, which believes it can reach truth through the unwavering absolutization of isolated ideological certainties, Schmidt always claimed that knowledge can only be attained in the critical passage through conflicting positions, that is to say, neither as a middle position between extremes, nor through the simple affirmation of one side. This is best exemplified in his portrayal of the relation between Hegel and Feuerbach. It was not Marx's intention simply to replace Hegel's, quote, world spirit with a material, quote, world substance, which will be an equally metaphysical principle. He did not reject Hegelian idealism abstractly like Feuerbach, but rather saw in it truth, expressed in an untrue form. Marx accepted the idealist view that the world is mediated through the subject. Marx considered, however, that he could bring home the full significance of this idea by showing what was the true pathos of, quote, creation, as presented by philosophers from Kant to Hegel. The creator of the objective world is the socio-historical life process of human beings. In modern times, extra-human natural existence has been reduced more and more to a function of human social organization. The philosophical reflection of this is that the determinations of objectivity have entered in greater and greater measure into the subject, until at the culminating point of post-Kantian speculation, they became completely absorbed in it, end quote. Alfred Schmidt. The aim of critical materialism is to help human beings escape the self-made prison of economic determinations in which human beings let themselves be degraded into objects of a blind and mechanical economic dynamic. The laws of economics for Marx do not form a universal metaphysical principle of explanation. Quote, the, quote, materialist character of Marx's theory does not amount to a confession of the incurable primacy of the economy, that anti-human abstraction achieved by the real situation. It is rather an attempt to direct men's attention towards the ghostly internal logic of their own condition, towards the pseudo-physics that makes them commodities, and at the same time provides the ideology according to which they are already in control of their own destinies, end quote. Schmidt. At this point, Schmidt refers to Horkheimer's diagnosis, quote, the process is accomplished not under the control of a conscious will, but as a natural occurrence. Everyday life results blindly, accidentally, and badly from the chaotic activity of individuals, industries, and states, end quote. Horkheimer, cited in Schmidt. In Marx, materialism does not entail the identification of the prevailing conditions, and similarly, the concept of nature does not aim at romantic transfiguration. Quote, Hegel described the first nature, a world of things existing outside of men, as a blind conceptless occurrence. The world of men, as the world of men, takes shape in the state, law, society, and the economy is for Hegel second nature, manifested reason, objective spirit. Marxist analysis opposes to this view, the view that Hegel's second quote second nature should rather be described in the terms Hegel applied to the first, namely, as the area of conceptlessness, where blind necessity and blind chance coincide. The quote second nature is still the quote first. Mankind has still not stepped beyond natural history. This fact explains the closeness of the method of Marxist sociology to that of natural science, bracket, Naturwissenschaft, and bracket. Many critics of Marx regard this method as inappropriate, but in fact the quote nature-like constitution of its object of investigation ensures that it is not a human science, bracket, Geisteswissenschaft, end bracket. When Marx treated the history of previous human society as a, quote, process of natural history, end quote, this had first of all the critical meaning that, quote, the laws of economics confront men in all, planless and incoherent production as objective laws over which they have no power, therefore in the form of laws of nature. Planless and incoherent production as objective laws over which they have no power, therefore in the form of laws of nature, end quote, Schmidt. With regard to the natural basis of human life, Schmidt acknowledges the ineliminable requirement of a metabolism between humans and nature, even if hunger, poverty, and exploitation are overcome, and the human being confronts the material world in a qualitatively new way as, quote, overseer and regulator, end quote. As Marx puts it in the Grundrisse, this does not overcome the relationship with the natural foundation of human life. Even after the economic compulsions of commodified labor are abolished, freedom remains dependent on the interaction with nature. The philosophical themes of his dissertation also characterize Schmidt's further works. In his essay titled On the Relation Between History and Nature in Dialectical Materialism, originally written for the book Existentialism and Marxism, published in 1965, and from 1971 onwards attached to the new editions of the thesis as an appendix, Schmidt again takes up the question of a dialectics of nature. One second, look that up. English to German. Let's see if there's anything good descriptions of this book. It doesn't appear to be. Anyway, back to the text. Schmidt develops his argument into a critique of the complementary yet one-sided thesis of Lukács and Western Marxism, according to which dialectics is strictly bound to human practice. This thesis, according to Schmidt, threatens to conceive of nature only as a social category, and thus lose sight of the natural basis of human existence, the metabolism with nature. In a postscript from 1971, Schmidt emphasizes again that Marx's, quote, critique of political economy should not be understood simply as a positive theory of economic development and some law-governed transition to socialism, as is often the case in the official Marxism of the labor movement. In the new edition of 1993, he adds the preface from the French version, which appeared in the same year and carries the subtitle, For an Ecological Materialism. Schmidt points out that Marx is not a consistent apologist for the development of the productive forces, but rather in the early writings criticizes the, quote, degradation of nature, end quote. Also in Capital, Marx refers to the, quote, natural limits of the exploitability of nature, end quote, and emphasizes that the productivity of labor itself is bound to natural conditions. Nevertheless, Schmidt critically finds an anthropocentrism in Marx's conception of nature. What Marx and Engels criticized in their time as a defect of, quote, contemplative materialism, end quote, has today to be rediscovered for the sake of regaining an unobstructed understanding of nature. If we want to experience nature not only as an object of science or as raw material, then this, quote, requires a philosophical approach that goes beyond the separation between humans and nature established by the subject-object schema of the process of labor and knowledge, end quote. Schmidt. The perspective oriented to human practice and history is not invalidated, but is certainly relativized. The question of a, quote, ecological materialism thus arises from within the context of contemporary existence. New section, Critique of Political Economy. One second. You know what? Fuck it, I am going to read all this. Critique of Political Economy is the investigation and presentation of the mode of production and ideology of bourgeois society begun by Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century. The critique is aimed simultaneously at classical political economy, social conditions, and the bourgeois ideology that conceals them. The aim of the critique of political economy is the recognition and abolition of this form of society by the exploited working class. In his exile in London, Marx published a first report on this topic in 1859, A Critique of Political Economy, and in 1867, the first volume of his work, Capital, Critique of Political Economy. According to Marx, the main mistake of classical political economy was that classical political economy's theorists either failed to show what the relationship between the amount of work required to produce goods and their exchange value actually is, e.g. Ricardo, or that they denied such a connection, e.g. Bailey. In contrast to the classics of political economy, Marx was concerned with lifting the, quote, ideological veil of surface phenomena and revealing the, quote, essence of the capitalist mode of production. Back to the text. While Schmidt's thesis was published in the... I didn't read the entire Wikipedia. I was going to, but I was like, yeah, it's too much. While Schmidt's thesis was published in the official, quote, Frankfurt Contribution to Sociology series of the Institute for Social Research, and while other important works from the 1960s appeared in Edition Surkamp, which was important for the intellectual development of West Germany, the critique of political economy today, 100 Years of Capital, which Schmidt co-edited with Walter Euchner, was somewhat removed from public attention. One second. Wikipedia says the Edition Surkamp is a book series published by Surkamp Verlag in paperback format. Since May 1963, 48 first editions have been published annually. By the beginning of 2022, a total of over 2,500 volumes. both literary and essayistic in nature. The edition Surkamp, initially edited by Siegfried Unzelt, influenced social discourse, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. The series is also known for its series design in spectral colors created by Willy Fleckhaus. And then I wanted to look up this book. And Walter Euchner. I'll read Walter Euchner's little biography on Wikipedia. Walter Euchner lived from 1933 to 2011 and was a German political scientist and professor at the University of Göttingen. Euchner was born to social democratic parents, both of whom had been members of the SAP since 1931 and who had to suffer Nazi persecution after the Nazis came to power because they were part of the social democratic resistance. After graduating from high school, Walter Euchner studied law and sociology from 1953 to 1958, and then history and political science from 1958 to 1963 at the universities of Tübingen, Munich, Heidelberg, and Frankfurt am Main. From 1960 to 1963, he was a research assistant at the chair of political science at the University of Tübingen. In 1963, he moved to the University of Frankfurt am Main as an assistant to the political scientist Irving Fetcher. I have Irving Fetcher's book Marx and Marxism on this channel, where he also taught until 1971. In 1966, he received his doctorate in philosophy of the study on natural law in the work of John Locke, which he advanced German research on Locke with important new interpretations, including his debate with C.B. Macpherson. In 1971, before his habilitation, Walter Euchner accepted a call as professor for political science at the Georg August University of Göttingen, a position he held until his retirement in 1999. Walter Euchner was married to the university professor Jutta Euchner, who lived from 1933 to 2006. Euchner researched questions of the history of political ideas, especially socialism, German domestic policy, political metaphors, and so-called biopolitics, focusing primarily on the social and political implications of self-directed evolution through genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and robotics. Walter Euchner compared Locke's position with the Stoic idea of natural law and with Immanuel Kant's ethical principles. His publications are Natural Law and Politics in John Locke, 1967, Positions of Modern Marxism, 1970, Egoism and the Common Good, Studies in the History of Bourgeois Philosophy, Karl Marx, 1983, Social Democracy and Democracy and the SPD's Understanding of Democracy in the Weimar Republic, 1986, The Political Philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, Political Opposition in Germany and an International Comparison, 1993, The Failure of Dictatorial Legitimation Patterns and the Future Viability of Democracy, 1995, An Introduction to John Locke, 1996, What is a Nation, 1996, History of Social Ideas in Germany, 2000, The Function of Visualization in Politics and Science. Back to the text. Let's also look. We never looked up that book. Yeah, I'm not seeing any good descriptions of this book. Back to the text. This book was published in 1968 by the Europäische Verlagsanstalt. According to Wikipedia, the European Publishing House, company name CEP European Publishing House, is a publishing house in the legal form of a GmbH with its registered office in Hamburg. The managing director is Irmela Reuters. Back to the text. This book, which was published in 1968 by the Europäische Verlag Sternstalt, recorded the presentations and discussion remarks of a colloquium organized by the Institute for Political Science in Frankfurt in September 1967. The director of the institute, Irving Fetcher, succeeded in gathering experts on Marxist theory from West and East Germany, the United States, France, Belgium, Austria, Yugoslavia, and Poland. The speakers ranged from Wolfgang Abendroth to Oswald von Neubruening. Who the hell is that? I'm only going to look up people that I don't know. German Wikipedia says Oswald von Neubruening lived from 1890 to 1991 and was a German Roman Catholic theologian, Jesuit priest, economist, and social philosopher who was considered the, quote, Nestor of Catholic social teaching, end quote. As an advisor to Pius XI, Neubruening played a key role in the formulation of the famous social encyclical Quadragesimo Anno of 1931, in which the social binding of property was demanded, and in which Neubruening developed the principles of subsidiarity. Neubruening's thinking is based on the classical natural law tradition and the basic principles of Catholic social teaching developed from it in the 19th century: personality, solidarity, and subsidiarity. In Neubruening's more than 1,800 publications, Neubruening dealt with questions of business ethics, economic, and social policy. Important topics were the relationship between labor and capital, the debate with Marxism, the question of codetermination, the development of Catholic social teaching, and thus the overcoming of the alienation of the working class from the church. That was the German Wikipedia introduction for Oswald von Neubruening. From Ernest Mandel, back to the text, from Ernest Mandel to Nikos Palantzis, from Roman Rozdowski to Elmar Altvater. While the 100th birthday of Marx's Capital provided the occasion for the colloquium, remarkably the subtitle of Capital was chosen as the title for the event, Critique of Political Economy. The underlying vision can be found in Schmidt's paper titled On the Concept of Knowledge in the Critique of Political Economy, and also in many of his published discussion remarks. It implied reading of Marx was soon to become significant for what was later called the, quote, new reading of Marx, end quote. See Elba 2008 in West Germany and beyond, especially in the works of Hans-Georg Backhaus, Hans-Jürgen Kroll, and Helmut Reichelt. Indeed, Schmidt's discussion with Nikos Palantzis already anticipates the confrontation of a Frankfurt School-inspired reading of Marx and the Marx interpretation of the Althusser school. As formulated in the extensive critical essays, The Structuralist Attack on History by Schmidt, 1969, and History and Structure, an essay on the Hegelian Marxist and structuralist theories of history. In fact, the discussions at the colloquium can be regarded as the starting point for the development of critical theory outside the academic and institutional framework, exemplified by the intellectual histories of the Frankfurt School by Martin J., Helmut Dubiel, Hauke Bronkhorst, and Rolf Wiggershaus. After the presentation of Roman Rozdowski, who was unable to deliver in person his comments on the method of Marx's Capital and its importance for contemporary Marxist scholarship, which I believe is on this channel, and following Nikos Palantzis, Schmidt took a pointed stand on the question of Hegel's role in the method of Marx's critique of political economy. For Schmidt, there is something like a, quote, ironic repetition of certain passages of Hegel's logic in Marx's Grundrisse and Capital. For Schmidt, this does not mean, however, that Marx is simply a Hegelian. On the contrary, it is a question of thinking with Marx. Quote, the extent to which the specific character of bourgeois society, which in reality ultimately underlies Hegel's philosophy, does not compel ideas of a, quote, existing abstraction, end quote, and the extent to which the value form, does not represent an abstraction carried out by the empirical world itself. The social world contains a conceptual element insofar as the social world reduces the concrete labor of individuals and individuals' products to quantifiable expressions of general human labor. Although this, quote, conceptual character of tangible empirical processes brings to the fore certain theoretical parallels to Hegel's thought, one should not be tempted to consider Hegelian and Marxist dialectics as homologous, end quote. Walter Euchner and Schmidt, 1968, or maybe that's just Schmidt, and Euchner and Schmidt is the editors of the book this essay is featured in. What initially looks like the adoption of the speculative premises of Hegel's logic thus does not entail endorsement of absolute idealism, according to Schmidt, but rather the conceptual doubling of a real process occurring in social practice. Quote, when Marx says that human beings would be portrayed by him as personifications of economic categories, so did I say quote? Quote, when Marx says that human beings would be portrayed by him as personifications of economic categories, this obviously sounds, quote, idealist. But it is an idealism that the world itself forces on people every day. For the, quote, materialist aspect of Marx's economy, if we were to speak in these terms, is precisely the domination of individuals by incomprehensible abstractions, which determines empirical reality as capitalist. One could say that Hegel's philosophy, which Marx famously accused of making the second into the first and the first into the second, is bourgeois society conceived as ontology. Hegel posits what is already present in the bourgeois mode of production, namely, the demotion of the genetically first, use-value creating concrete labor to an appendage of what derives from it, abstract labor, end quote. Schmidt. How can we comprehend this rule by abstractions without falling into a circle, such that reality can only be described with the aid of Hegel's categories, which in turn are legitimized through their congruence with the very reality that they posited in thought? Hegel's logic does not reconstruct the thoughts of God before the creation of the world, as Hegel himself wanted, but rather unintentionally expresses the secret of bourgeois society, albeit as ontology. In this manner, and despite its transformation into ontology, Hegel's philosophy already provides the conceptual means for grasping the objective structures of social reality. Schmidt formulates the critical point of Marx's theory with reference to the theme of his thesis. Quote, the methodologically most important thought of materialist dialectics seems to me to consist in the distinction between nature as first nature, in the sense of the metabolism which grounds human existence, from second nature. This forms the specifically capitalist problem of materialism. While the metabolism between humans and nature is a material fact that can indeed change, yet traverses mankind's history in general. I believe that we should keep this double foundation of Marx's argument in mind, and think about whether we are discussing second or first nature. Therefore, whether we are discussing the problematic of alienation, that is, commodity fetishism or materialism in a much more elementary sense, as is also found in Marx, end quote. Schmidt. In Schmidt's own paper, Zum Erkenntnisbegriff der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, on the concept of cognition in the critique of political economy, Schmidt defends Marx against the accusation of economism. Quote, as the investigations of capital show, the one-sided, idealistically deplored, quote, economism is an abstraction which is accomplished not by the theorist but by social reality on a daily basis, end quote. With the characterization of his theory as a, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, Marx makes his specific intention clear. Quote, Marx understands it in a double sense. First, as a critique of the real political-economic relations which necessarily arise from the capitalist mode of production, and second, as a critique of political economy as the comprehensive science of the whole life process. Le monde moral, as it was called in the 18th century, in which the theoretical self-understanding of bourgeois society expressed itself most adequately. The empirically given relations of production form the immediate object of Marx's investigation. But, and Marx emphatically pointed this out against Lassalle, is not possible to conceptualize this given object in its immediacy. The actual, quote, system of bourgeois economy, end quote, is apprehended by means of a, quote, critique of economic categories, end quote, as they appeared in the history of economic thinking. In this respect, Marx's critique of capitalism is largely a critique of the theories of political economy, from William Petty to David Ricardo. By keeping the intellectual premises of bourgeois economy in tight focus, Marx exposes the contradictions between these premises and their social reality, and through them the objective contradictions of social reality itself. Dialectics, therefore, is by no means, quote, ontologically asserted by Marx. Dialectics is not simply a matter of the process of thought, but of reality too. However, this reality is not independent of the concepts through which that reality is grasped. But different from Hegel, reality is not reducible to reality's concept. One should neither suppress the mediation of Marx's object of, quote, critique through theory and its historical interest, nor deny the fact that the object is mediated in itself, which makes the theory into an objective theory, end quote. While in Hegel's logic, quote, the method is the form of movement of the absolute itself, and the total sequence of categories coincides with the eternal object, end quote. For Marx, the method and object are not identical. Modes of inquiry and modes of presentation must therefore be, quote, formally distinguished from Marx. Indeed, in his Philosophy of Nature, and in certain parts of the Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Hegel too distinguishes between inquiry, the, quote, path of emergence of science, end quote, and presentation, the, quote, path in itself when it is complete, end quote. As Schmidt vividly points out, this distinction arises where the material analyzed with the aid of, quote, concepts of the understanding, end quote, must be converted into, quote, concepts of reason. In summary, Schmidt states that, quote, the correct understanding of Marx's method in Capital stands and falls with the concept of, quote, presentation, end quote, end quote. It is at this point that he refers to Lire le Capital, bracket, Reading Capital, end bracket, published in 1965, highlighting the contribution of Jacques Rancière, the concept of, quote, critique, and the, quote, critique of political economy, from the 1844 manuscript to Capital. With Reading Capital is the book with Althusser and like Etienne Ballapart and other people. With reference to Horkheimer's 1934 article in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung titled The Rationalism Debate in Contemporary Philosophy, Schmidt points out that the distinction between inquiry and presentation, between isolated analytical dissection and the integrating presentation of the dissected material, which brings the living whole, grasped by the individual sciences only one-sidedly, to, quote, concrete unity, corresponds with the methodological self-understanding of the Institute for Social Research at that time. Logically, the presentation does not simply follow the course of history. On the contrary, it pursues, quote, a path opposite to the real development, end quote. It begins with the finished product of the process of development. Here Schmidt provides an important correction to the long-held view that assumes with Engels that in the opening chapters of Capital, Marx wanted to depict by means of historical summary, a phase of pre-capitalist, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. For a critique of the notion of simple commodity production, in the early chapters of Marx's Capital, see the piece titled The Myth of Simple Commodity Production by C.J. Arthur on this channel. Marx's presentation does not follow the course of history. It often takes the opposite path. Chronological sequence and logical order of presentation do not coincide. For the Marxist understanding of science, as well as for the self-understanding of the founding generation of the Frankfurt School, the distinction between inquiry and presentation, as well as the distinction between essence and appearance, is constitutive. Quote, all science would be superfluous if the form of appearance of things directly coincided with their essence, end quote. The distinction between essence and appearance, between the, quote, apparent and real movement, end quote, has direct consequences for both the methodological self-understanding of the theory and its substantive content. This becomes clear in contrasting classical political economy in so-called, quote, vulgar economics, end quote. Schmidt argues that Marx presents a twofold opposition against classical economics on the one hand, and with, quote, vulgar economics on the other hand, starting with say. This contrast is based on the distinction between society and society's immediate appearance and law, appearance and essence, which Marx identifies with the scientific approach. Quote, Marx acknowledges that the classical economists, and especially Ricardo, despite their class standpoint which regarded the capitalist mode of production as natural and constant, all sought to systematically investigate its, quote, interconnection, while vulgar economics, that is, all economics since the dissolution of the Ricardo school, moved only within the context of appearance, falling into the crude empiricism of ideological consciousness, end quote. Schmidt. However, Schmidt does not declare the difference between essence and appearance formulated here as a methodologically universal principle, but ties it back to a historically specific form of social relations. The non-identity of appearance and essence, constitutive for Marx, does not reside in society as such, but rather in capitalist social relations. Pre-capitalist forms of domination are thus more transparent because they, quote, are not abstract, but based on personal relations of dependency, end quote. Excuse me, that's fucking disgusting. But I'm sick, again, if you can believe it. Against the claims to objectivity of economic analysis, particularly by scientists from the Soviet bloc at the aforementioned meeting, Schmidt asserts alongside the early Engels that the natural laws of capitalist development ultimately depend on the unconsciousness of the participants. According to Marx, quote, the purpose of economics is precisely for human beings to consciously shape their conditions and not be bound by any second nature, which is much more violent than the first, inasmuch as the subject has objectified itself in second nature. The more subjectivity is embodied in objectivity, the more, quote, consciousness independent, end quote, it is, thus requiring its critique and abolition, end quote. Schmidt. Here it is easy to see that the Frankfurt School of Reading of Marx took its starting point from very different themes from those of the Parisian Althusser group, which conceived of Marx's theory as a breakthrough to scientific analysis of social processes. Schmidt follows a philosophical interpretation, characteristic of critical theory in general, according to which Marx's theory is to be seen as an attempt to overcome philosophy by philosophy's practical realization. The overcoming of philosophy is emancipation and liberation, not scientification. From this understanding of Marx's critique, Schmidt's argument establishes connections to a philosophy of praxis, and in particular to the existentialist interpretation of Marx by the early Marcuse. In contrast to Habermas, Schmidt was not primarily concerned with making certain elements of Marx's theory scientifically, quote, compatible through an attempt at reconstruction or through their translation into another theoretical language. Schmidt's aim was, in essence, to liberate Marx's theory from the ideological ballast of traditional party Marxism in order to lay bare the critical character of Marx's theory. New section, Historical Materialism as Critical Theory. Leaving aside the debate with Nikos Palantzas at the Frankfurt Colloquium, the mentioning of Althusser and Rancière in a footnote to his own paper at the seminar, Schmidt's first reference to French structuralism comes in an essay from 1967 titled On History and Historiography in Materialist Dialectics, published as a contribution to the book Consequences of Social Theory Consequences of a Theory, Essays on Marx's Capital, published 1967. I'm not seeing any good descriptions for this book. Back to the text. Following Lucien Goldman, Henri Lefebvre, and Jean-Paul Sartre, Schmidt understands structuralism, in particular Levi-Strauss's contribution, as proof that the empirical methods of social sciences were gradually displacing the critical role of philosophy for public discourse in France, too. Structuralism was not yet perceived as a rival interpretation of Marxist theory, but as a new Eliatism. The hell does that mean? Eleatism. Okay, so Wikipedia says, English Wikipedia says, the Eleatics were a group of pre-Socratic philosophers in school of thought in the 5th century BC, centered around the ancient Greek colony of Elea, ancient Greece, located around 80 miles southeast of Naples in southern Italy, then known as Magna Graecia. I don't know if I'm saying that right. The primary philosophers who are associated with the Eleatic doctrines are Parmenides, Zeno of Elea, and Melissus of Samos, although other Italian philosophers such as Xenophanes of Colophon and Empedocles have also sometimes been classified as members of this movement. The Eleatics have traditionally been seen as advocating a strict metaphysical view of monism in response to the materialist monism advocated by their predecessor, the Ionian school. It says, I don't know if this is AI generated or what, but on Google it says, what did the Eleatics believe? And it says the key doctrines traditionally attributed to the Eleatic philosophers include monism, there is only one thing, stability, nothing moves, changelessness, and the denigration of the senses in favor of the proofs of reason and argument. Back to the text. So that makes sense that they'd call it, I'm going to reread the sentence that it was used in. Structuralism was not yet perceived as a rival interpretation of Marxist theory, but as a, quote, new Eleatism, an unhistorical form of sociological thinking, which seems like it would, that phrase would mean a sociological thinking where nothing moves. In Schmidt's argument, the new Eleatism corresponds to a historical period of state intervention for the sake of preventing the eruption of major conflicts and crises. The structuralist method proceeds from the most general mental structures, supposedly common to all cultures, peoples, and societies, and then prescribes them to acting subjects. This runs the risk, in a ciphered idealist form, of turning what Marx critiqued, that is, the rule by abstractions, reified society, into an affirmative normative stance. With Sartre, Schmidt arrives at the conclusion that structuralism would ultimately serve the ideological defense against historical materialism. Already in 1923, in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács had formulated the crucial objections against the unhistorical or anti-historical essence of bourgeois thinking. At this point in Schmidt's intellectual development, Schmidt treated the structuralism as an object for ideology critique rather than an intellectual challenge. This changes in The Structuralist Attack on History, in the volume edited by Schmidt himself, Contributions to Materialist Epistemology. In particular, Althusser's theoretical rejection of philosophical humanism, his definition of humanism as an ideology, and the dichotomizing division of Marx's work into an ideological phase and a scientific phase are not acceptable to Schmidt. Althusser's doctrine of ideology, which Schmidt criticized even before Althusser formulated his theory of ideological state apparatuses and the concept of interpellation, appears in Schmidt as a hardly original recapitulation of Mannheimian ideas. It is at any rate incompatible with the idea of liberating human beings from domination by incomprehensible economic abstractions. Althusser, in fact, discards everything that embodies the emancipatory message of Marxism for Schmidt, and Schmidt places Althusser close to the functionalist systems theory of Talcott Parsons. On Schmidt's essay, Schmidt's essay, however, focuses mostly on the work of Levi-Strauss, although he identifies Althusser with Levi-Strauss's stance through the collective singular term, quote, structuralism. The key points of his critique originate primarily from Sartre, Lefebvre, and Goldman. In his 1971 book, History and Structure, Schmidt considers Althusser's reading of Marx as a positive challenge, even though he notes that, quote, the, quote, constructive aspect of the method of capital can be more adequately grounded in a materialist interpretation of Hegel, end quote. Schmidt. I think History and Structure is translated. And it's translated by Jeffrey Herf. I have some pieces by Jeffrey Herf about anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And it says the description of History and Structure is very simple. It just says, well-written, clear, and informed, the study does much to clarify the present discourse between the Frankfurt School's critical theorists and the structuralisms. Back to the text. At the center of the debate with the, quote, Althusser school is the relationship between the logical and the historical. Schmidt emphasizes, with Althusser and against traditional Marxist orthodoxy, that the process of cognition is characterized by relative autonomy in the face of its object and does not simply reproduce its historical process. Schmidt combines with this the thesis of the cognitive primacy of the logical rather than the historical. In this context, Schmidt returns to his earlier argument about the difference between the mode of inquiry and the mode of presentation, referring to analogous distinctions between analysis and dialectics in Hegel's philosophy of nature. In Marx as in Hegel, the, quote, material gathered in the individual sciences is to be presented in a rational, i.e. philosophical form. On the whole, Schmidt agrees with the Althusserians on one of their fundamental concerns, the critique of historicist interpretations of Marx's work. In Capital, Marx advocates anything but an unreflective historicism that makes knowledge run directly parallel with the chronological sequence of events. Schmidt concurs with structuralist interpreters like Althusser and Poulantzas up to this point. The consensus ends when they deny the constitutive role of Hegel's logic for Marx's economic work. Indeed, in spite of itself concerning value form analysis, Althusser's pointed formula, according to which the, quote, simple only ever exists within a complex structure, end quote, can easily be reformulated into Hegelian terms. In the final part of his book, Schmidt discusses the role of Gaston Bachelard and the historical, empirical work of Cavieres, Canguilhem, and Foucault for Althusser's understanding of science and the history of science. I'll look some of these people up. Gaston Bachelard lived from 1884 to 1962 and was a French philosopher who was interested in the theory of science and poetry. In Science and Artistic Imagination, Bachelard saw two different but equally valuable ways of opening up to the differences of the new and growing as a human being. In the area of the theory of science, Bachelard's terms obstacle to knowledge and epistemological profile are important. Jean Cavieres was a French philosopher and mathematician. He took part in the resistance against the German occupation, was tortured, and then shot. And finally, Canguilhem, or Canguilhem. Georges Canguilhem, that's how I'm assuming you're saying it. You say it. Lived from 1904 to 1995 and was a French philosopher and physician who specialized in epistemology and the philosophy of science, in particular biology. Back to the text. Schmidt highlights the primacy of the logical in the reconstruction of historical processes. Against chronological sequence, Marx himself considers the anatomy of man as a key to the anatomy of the ape. Schmidt, however, points to the danger that this methodological principle tends to solidify underhandedly into ontological certainties. Quote, what is theoretically secondary for the present becomes null and void. End quote. As Marx writes in 1858, quote, the dialectical form of presentation is right only when the dialectical form of presentation knows the dialectical form of presentation's own limits. End quote. Marx. Schmidt never published the second volume of History and Structure to which he repeatedly refers. In Critical Theory as a Philosophy of History, published in 1976, which dates back to a lecture he gave in 1974 on the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Institute for Social Research, Schmidt revisited the decisive themes of his debate with Althusser on structuralism.
Kritische Theorie als Geschichtsphilosophie.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any good descriptions of that book. In Critical Theory as Philosophy of History, 1976, which dates back to a lecture he gave in June 1974 on the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Institute for Social Research, Schmidt revisits the decisive themes of his debate with Althusser on structuralism, starting from Horkheimer's confrontation with Dilthey, Heidegger, and the Baden School of Neo-Kantianism, including Karl Mannheim's Sociology of Knowledge. He explains the thesis of the, quote, natural law character of history hitherto, and the consequences that result from its action theoretical, quote, intelligibility. Wilhelm Dilthey lived from 1833 to 1911 and was a German theologian, high school teacher, and philosopher. In contrast to the naturalism that was widespread at the time, Dilthey developed a life philosophical foundation that no longer explained human life and the forms of its expression solely according to natural laws, but rather sought to understand the inherent laws of human intellectual life. Dilthey expanded this approach on the basis of scientific theory, and in contrast to the natural sciences, formulated a theory of the humanities, of which Dilthey is considered the founder. As a method, Dilthey developed hermeneutics and interpretive psychology in a significant way. Wilhelm Dilthey applied his methods empirically in the Weltanschauungslehre, a scheme of interpretation for what he considered to be failed systems of metaphysics. In it, Dilthey attempted to show how all different and contradictory metaphysical systems have their common origin in the context of human life, at the same time categorizing the historical approaches according to different, quote, types of Weltanschauung. And I think we all know who Heidegger is. Karl Mannheim lived from 1893 to 1947. Karl Mannheim was a sociologist and philosopher of Austro-Hungarian origin, Jewish religion, and German and British citizenship. Let me see if there's anything for sociology of knowledge. Wikipedia says the sociology of knowledge is the study of the relationship between human thought, the social context within which it arises, and the effects that prevailing ideas have on societies. It's not a specialized area of sociology, instead it deals with broad fundamental questions about the extent and limits of social influences on individuals' lives and the social cultural basis of our knowledge about the world. The sociology of knowledge has a subclass and a complement. Its subclass is sociology of scientific knowledge. Its complement is the sociology of ignorance. The sociology of knowledge was pioneered primarily by the sociologist Emile Durkheim at the beginning of the 20th century. Durkheim's work deals directly with how conceptual thought, language, and logic can be influenced by the societal milieu in which they arise. The 1903 essay, Primitive Classification, by Durkheim and Marcel Mauss invoked, quote, primitive group mythology to argue that classification systems are collectively based, and that the divisions within these systems derive from social categories. In his 1912 The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, Durkheim elaborated on this theory of knowledge. In this work, Durkheim explained how languages, concepts, and the categories, such as space and time, used in logical thought have a sociological origin. Neither Durkheim nor Mauss specifically coined the term sociology of knowledge. However, their work was an exceptional contribution to the subject. The widespread use of the term sociology of knowledge emerged in the 1920s when several German-speaking sociologists, most notably Max Scheler and Karl Mannheim, wrote extensively on sociological aspects of knowledge. This was followed in 1937 by a much-cited survey of the subject by Robert K. Merton, the American sociologist, The Sociology of Knowledge. With the dominance of functionalism through the middle years of the 20th century, the sociology of knowledge remained on the periphery of mainstream sociological thought. However, sociology of knowledge was reinvented and applied closely to everyday life in the 1960s, particularly by Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckman in The Social Construction of Reality, 1966. It is still central for methods dealing with a qualitative understanding of human society. Compare socially constructed reality. The, quote, genealogical and, quote, archaeological studies of Michel Foucault are of considerable contemporary influence. Back to the text. Finally, Schmidt's account turns to the historical materialist notion of supersession, Aufhebbarkeit, which he develops against structuralism as the central historical philosophical category of critical theory. Back to the text. Sorry, I was looking for Aufhebbarkeit. For a critical theory of society, it is necessary to subordinate the hitherto blind natural power of the process of social production to human consciousness. With Adorno's negative dialectic, Schmidt stressed that, quote, those laws can be abolished, end quote, and that the coming realm of freedom would be released from them. Schmidt's argument is not unique as such. For Rosa Luxemburg, too, political economy comes to a close once the anarchic economy of capitalism makes way for consciously organized relations of social production. That is why, according to Luxemburg, Marx conceived of his economic doctrine as a critique of political economy. Similarly, as Bukharin explains in 1920, quote, theoretical political economy is the study of social economy based on the production of commodities, i.e. the study of an unorganized social economy, end quote. Bukharin. Only where production is anarchic does social life manifest itself in the form of, quote, elementary laws of nature, end quote, independent of the will of individuals or communities, and thus function with the same, quote, blind necessity as the law of gravity. Schmidt thus recalls that both the older critical theory and even the more reflective authors of orthodox Marxism at the beginning of the century by no means advocated a consistent historical determinism. The laws of capitalist development, as analyzed by Marx, do not imply that social analysis should ultimately be pursued with the methods of natural science. Rather, they point to a problem. According to Schmidt, critical theory conceptualizes the socially constituted lawfulness of historical development that characterizes the inverted (Verkehrte) and perverted (Verruchte) world of capitalist social relations. Let's see if there's anything for these words on German Wikipedia. Verkehrte. Fuck. Ah, god damn it. Okay, where am I? Sorry, I accidentally clicked out of the fucking thing I was looking at. Back to the text. In Schmidt's philosophical works, undogmatic materialism, sensuality, corporeality, and the social mediation of nature remain key, as does Schmidt's insistence on the irreducibility of naturalness to social mediation. Schmidt places Marx in a tradition of materialism that does not reduce nature to the dimension of instrumental control, but, with recourse to Feuerbach and Goethe, traces another approach to nature. As Horkheimer and Adorno emphasize in their preliminary remarks to his thesis, quote, the dissolution of all reality into mere nature, into atomic particles, or whatever counts as the last component according to the state of science, is by no means unconditional, ... The quantifying conception of nature as it must prevail in laboratories today cannot immediately be the same as the concept of nature in a humanity no longer divided in itself, no longer entrapped in nature, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Schmidt's return to the subject of materialism was not primarily concerned with the reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy as a critical analysis of domination by incomprehensible abstractions. Rather, it was concerned with the very idea of materialism as the underlying premise of the critique of political economy. In his later dialogue with Feuerbach, Goethe, Schopenhauer, and Freud, Schmidt continued his argument for a non-reductive materialism. Schmidt thus remained faithful to the topic of his thesis, where he turned his back on the then dominant debates about Marx. Similarly, his engagement with Werner Post in 1975, titled What is Materialism?, furthered this trend. Werner Post lived from 1940 to 2018. Werner Post is a German Roman Catholic theologian and philosopher. He became known primarily for his studies on Karl Marx. Back to the text. For Schmidt, the touchstone of materialism is not its accordance to the latest state of research in the natural sciences, but its capacity for insight into human suffering. When Schmidt deals with nature beyond human control, Schmidt is not concerned with a romantic idolatry of nature. This remains ultimately bound to its counter-image in the form of unbridled natural domination. But the insight that nature in the here and now must not be hypostatized into a norm. New section on dialectics. Schmidt's philosophizing is characterized by an unpretentious proclivity for dialectical formulations. Schmidt does not discuss dialectics from the outside, from the perspective of traditional logic, for instance. Rather, Schmidt thinks dialectically, formulating his thoughts in dialectical terms, thereby expounding the social nature of capitalist society from within. He was skeptical of attempting an analytical reconstruction of dialectics without dialectical means. Dialectics for Schmidt is a medium of thought, not an object for rational reconstruction separate from the human condition. What comes into play with Schmidt against Althusser structuralism as a science of society, which cannot seriously deny the presence of Hegelian motifs and their genetic significance in Marx, but rather, to put it pointedly, follows motifs of linguistic structuralism for the sake of appropriating Hegel's objective spirit without Hegel's metaphysics. It also implicitly directed against certain tendencies within contemporary critical theory. Axel Honneth and Ulrich Uvermann also defend a theory of objective spirit, which they developed by different conceptual means. Wikipedia says Ulrich Uvermann lived from 1940 to 2021 and was a German sociologist and university professor. From 1977 until his retirement in 2008, he held the chair for sociology and social psychology at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. Ulrich Uvermann founded objective hermeneutics. Back to the text. In Honneth and Uvermann's argument, social objectivity does not stand for social domination by incomprehensible economic abstractions. Rather, they treat social objectivity as an institutional order or objective structure of meaning. Schmidt, in contrast, keeps the occasionally uncomfortable memory of the negativism of critical theory alive, a theory of social objectivity spelled out by means of speech act theory, structuralism, or variants of neo-pragmatism, risk resulting in a reified ontology that lacks critical consciousness and emancipatory insight. The step from the negative ontology of social nature to an apologetic ontology of social objectivity would in this manner be misunderstood as a theoretical advance. Against this and beyond the critique of social objectivity as second nature, Schmidt develops a concept of nature unconstrained by the narrow confines of positivism, even if this means incorporating the metaphysical tradition of Spinoza and its reception by Goethe, or Schopenhauer's, quote, crypto-materialism, into the argument. New section, conclusion. Schmidt's critical materialism of second nature opposes both traditional Marxism and the structuralist reading of Marx. The objectivity of the social is not an indication of its rationality, but of its socially coercive character. In the conflict of a second nature, however, conflicting contemporary interpretations of Hegel's conception of objective spirit collide, and their tension-ridden character cannot simply be removed by decree. The objectivity of the social, which renders society an object of casual analysis, can be understood in terms of institutions, rules, and conventions that acquire their own existence in opposition to the subjective ideas and intentions of individuals, yet without being completely separable from their actions. This raises the question of the extent to which the social concept of social objectivity and social laws of nature can be extended into a generalized critique of linguistic rules, social conventions, and institutional orders, without ultimately reproducing the methodological individualism of liberal theory as a utopian perspective of critique. Schmidt strictly binds the theory of social laws of nature developed by Marx to the structural features of a society characterized by capitalist commodity production. He thus rejects all attempts to understand this critical theory of the social nature of capitalist social relations as an ahistorical doctrine of invariance. Another question arises in connection with the concept of second nature in light of John McDowell's discussion of naturalized Platonism. How must nature be constructed so that nature can be conceived not only as a space of causal relations of determination, but also of socially embodied freedom and reason? Wikipedia says John McDowell was born in 1942 and is a South African philosopher, formerly a fellow of University College, Oxford, and now university professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Although John McDowell has written on metaphysics, epistemology, ancient philosophy, nature, and metaethics, McDowell's most influential work has been in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. John McDowell was one of 3 recipients of the 2010 Andrew W. Mellon Foundation's Distinguished Achievement Award, and is a fellow of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the British Academy. McDowell has throughout his career understood philosophy to be, quote, therapeutic, and thereby to, quote, leave everything as it is, end quote. Wittgenstein Philosophical Investigations, which McDowell understands to be a form of philosophical quietism, although he does not consider himself to be a, quote, quietist. The philosophical quietist believes that philosophy cannot make any explanatory comment about how, for example, thought and talk relate to the world, but can, by offering redescriptions of philosophically problematic cases, return the confused philosopher to a state of intellectual perspicacity. However, in defending this quietistic perspective, McDowell has engaged with the work of leading contemporaries in such a way as to therapeutically dissolve what he takes to be philosophical error, while defending major positions and interpretations from major figures in philosophical history and developing original and distinctive theses about language, mind, and value. In each case, he has tried to resist the influence of what he regards as a scientific, reductive form of philosophical naturalism that has become very commonplace in our historic moment, while nevertheless defending a form of, quote, Aristotelian naturalism, bolstered by key insights from Hegel, Wittgenstein, and others. Back to the text. Another question arises in connection with the concept of second nature in light of John McDowell's discussion of naturalized Platonism. See McDowell, 1996. How must nature be constructed so that nature can be conceived not only as a space of causal relations of determination, but also of socially embodied freedom and reason? This is not primarily a question about the conditions under which meaningful action, symbolic structures, and normative orders can be causally effective, and how constraints of social nature can be overcome through rational practice. Rather, if we want to follow the conviction that, at least in principle, not only blind natural laws, but also insights, reasons, and arguments can be effective, then the question at issue is how to conceive nature in a way that makes this possible. The critical theorist does not conclude that wherever human practice follows rules, these must be forms of alienation and socially produced unconsciousness. However, it is distinctive of this theory that it does not let itself be taken in by the socially objective character of institutions, rules, and norms. On the contrary, it uncovers their coercive character and exposes them to critique. Social orders do not constitute an unquestionable primacy. They are philosophically on trial. When Marx describes capital as a, quote, automatic subject, this also implies a fundamental critique. This is true even if the depersonalized social relations of capitalist exchange and exploitation, when compared with pre-modern relations of bondage, are considered as, quote, progress in the consciousness of freedom, end quote, Hegel, or, quote, normative progress, end quote, in Hanet's sense. A critical materialism of second nature is no ahistorical universalized negativism, which from the very start conceives every form of social objectivity only as an expression of reification. A critical materialism of second nature implies, however, an important corrective against the social theoretical gullibility currently shaping the debate on second nature, as can be seen, for example, from the call for abstracts for the 2017 International Hegel Congress on second nature. In his philosophical historical studies, Schmidt did not strive for superficial topicality. Schmidt did not shy away from pursuing alleged esoteric detours through the history of materialism, working through now almost forgotten debates and reintroducing medieval heretics, ostracized precursors, and lost strands of the Enlightenment. Schmidt's work on the intellectual history of critical theory and its political historical realm of experience are particularly important today, especially if we want to see Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse not just as precursors and instigators of contemporary varieties of critical theory, from communicative reason to recognition theory, but take them seriously in their own nowadays seemingly old-fashioned philosophical profiles, even though neither the philosophical materialism of the French Enlightenment nor the philosophy of Schopenhauer are currently in vogue. Schmidt's engagement with Marx makes it clear that philosophical insights can often be won from intensive examination of the texts themselves and their material content, rather than by superficial attempts at bringing them up to date, a task primarily concerned with the adaptation of relevant themes to the guiding ideas of the academic zeitgeist. Schmidt has supplied important impulses for the internal discussion of Marx and for a critical concept of materialism. Even though these have not been mentioned in the official track record of critical theory until now, or figure only in the margins, their importance can be found in works outside the narrow specialist community of philosophy. In contrast to both the Althusser school and representatives of the, quote, new reading of Marx, Schmidt is not simply concerned with the internal reconstruction of the original program of a critique of political economy. Schmidt's reference to Marx is not blinded by the systematic character of Marx's analysis. The grandiose systematic architecture of his theory is the expression of the tragedy of individuals. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.